So welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is MBTI weekend. So today we have got this amazing presentation by Aiden as a part of the Practical Jung. It's going to be on the Jungian basis of Myers-Briggs. I'm a big Jung fan, and I came to Myers-Briggs through Jung. My primary interest is the psychological functions of Jung, and the depth that Jung brings to the topic is orders of magnitude greater than most people who practice MBTI. So this is the right way to actually master the topic. And Aiden, I'm really looking forward to his presentation. I also want to let you know that immediately after this presentation at 5 o'clock, I've assembled everybody that I know in New York who knows this topic, and they're all going to be giving their take on how they approach, how they use MBTI and Jungian functions in their life. So don't miss that. All right. So with that, welcome everybody again to 52 Living Ideas. I'm delighted to have Aiden Moore present on Jungian basis, Jungian foundations of Myers-Briggs. Take it away, Aiden.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thank you everyone for being here. Just so you know, the first part of the conversation will be also used as a podcast. So when I talk about Practical Jung or welcome to the episode, this kind of thing, that's what I'm talking about. I'm glad Shrikant spoke a little bit about the Jungian depth of Myers-Briggs, because that is also my orientation. So really today, I'm going to be talking more about the Jungian roots, where Myers-Briggs comes from. I'm going to assume a lot of you know some about Myers-Briggs, so you'll have a lot of information about the functions and things like this. I'll be going more into the Jungian roots, where these ideas come from. Okay, so this is the first lecture I've done like this, so it'll be a new experience for all of us. But here we go. So welcome to this episode of Practical Jung. Today's topic will be the Jungian roots of Myers-Briggs, and I'm wearing a different hat today. Normally I'm interviewing other Jungian experts, but today I will be lecturing on the topic. It's one that's very close to my heart, and it has surprised me along the way as somebody who is quite steeped in Jungian thought and also quite interested in Myers-Briggs, how those two camps don't always cross over so much. And so my hope in this episode is to dig a little bit into the Jungian roots, a little bit deeper into some of these concepts that have made their way into the Myers-Briggs, and a little deeper into where they come from. So first of all, who I am, my name is Aiden Moore. I'm a success coach. So I work primarily with entrepreneurs, artists, and coaches, bridging the gap between their current challenges and beliefs and the dream life that they're carrying. Another way I put it is sort of bridging the gap between the true self and the false self. I'm also a certified Myers-Briggs practitioner, although my Myers-Briggs background, again, comes more from the Jungian side of things. And how I discovered MBTI was in my former career as a professional musician. I had moved to New York for a season of time. I'm currently in Los Angeles, but I had moved to New York to work on Broadway. And it was kind of a big change in my life of moving across the country, and there were a lot of changes going on. It was a bit chaotic for me. And it was at that time that I discovered Myers-Briggs. And I took one of these free online tests, which I know are not, the same, right? I mean, they don't have the same research, but they have all these free versions you can take online. And I took one, and I read my type, and I was so struck. I was so amazed, because it felt like the blurb, it was like the person had written about me. It was just so spot on. And it just struck me. It hit me like a brick. Almost was like, how does this person know me, kind of a feeling. And so I had my friends. At that time I was working, it was a show called Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. And I was working with a bunch of musicians in the pit orchestra. And I brought the test into my friends and had them take it. And they had the same experience, right? So that was like, they were different types. I'm an INFP, but I had friends that were ISFJ, ENFJ, ENFP, that were all working in the same pit orchestra, but had different types. And they read their descriptions and it resonated with them, just like my description had resonated with me. But when we swapped, like when I read the description of my ISFJ friend, for example, it didn't sound like me at all. Or when I read my ENFJ friend, it didn't sound like me at all. And it was just like a lightning bolt for me, because what I realized was previously, I had sort of been walking around with this quiet assumption that everybody was seeing things the same way on some fundamental level, that everybody was perceiving things the same way on some fundamental level, making decisions in some sort of fundamental same way. And it just went right out the window when I had this experience. That, oh my gosh, we can perceive things quite differently and make decisions quite differently. And it really stuck with me ever since. So that was kind of my intro to Myers-Briggs. It was around the same time I was getting into analytical psychology or Jungian thought. So now it's 10 years later and these things are a big part of my life, but it really started at that moment of the realization of, oh my gosh, we see things differently, we make decisions differently. So I'm going to move into the Jungian part of the lecture. A quick intro. I'm going to assume that some of you are familiar with Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist in the 20th century, and he was an explorer of the unconscious. He was an explorer of the psyche. He was a contemporary of Freud and Adler, and became a part of the group that now, when we look back historically, we would call depth psychology, right? Depth psychologists, which is DEPTH, and it's basically psychologists who are looking at the unconscious, who are looking at the unconscious dimension of the psyche and how it influences a person, how it influences a person's life. And, you know, he was a pioneer in that regard. He coined several terms, notably for our group, extroversion and introversion, the attitudes. It was coined by him. He coined the functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And he coined the term complex, a lesser known fact, although we usually associate that with Freud. And he coined these ideas of archetypes and the collective unconscious, which is quite a deep topic. We won't really touch on that too much in this lecture, but it's a lot of depth there. And interestingly, I'm noticing in the chat too about Freud and Jung. There was an age gap there, and not only that, Jung was at one time was mentored by Freud. Freud was sort of teaching Jung, and Jung was trying to fit his ideas into a Freudian framework at that time. They had a very close relationship. Freud called Jung the son he never had. So it was this very potent relationship. But much as he tried, Jung couldn't quite fit his ideas into a Freudian framework. He published a book called The Symbols of Transformation that actually conflicted quite directly with Freudian ideas, and it caused a rift in their relationship. They discontinued their professional and personal relationship at that point, which was a lot of pain, I think, actually, for Jung. But he went on to come up with these amazing ideas that we get to talk about today. So perhaps, you know, there's a good side to this. My goal in this conversation is going to be trying to make the Jungian perspective a little bit more accessible. What I've noticed in my readings, I don't know if you've read any of his collected works, any of the writings that come directly from Jung. They're at times very challenging to read. They're quite dense. They're quite academic. It's challenging. It's hard to just sit and read it and sort of absorb it. It's like checking references, checking footnotes. He's kind of all over the place. But I find this to be sort of disappointing in a way, because there's such practical ideas on some level. Like, they're so applicable to life, right? These are ideas that if we digest them, they're quite potent and to practically affect a person's life. But the way that they're presented is a little bit inaccessible at times. So this whole series, Practical Jung, is to try to break that down a little bit, bring it into practicality and how we can use it in our lives in ways that really it can be used. So I'm going to dive into the attitudes and the functions, right? So this is the literal Jungian roots of Myers-Briggs. The ideas come from work he published in 1921. It was called The Psychology of, oh no, I'm forgetting the name of it because I'm nervous, but whatever, it's his 6 collected works. And funnily enough, when it first was published, it was The Psychology of Types, I think. And it had a subtitle, which was, and on the psychology of individuation. That title doesn't remain anymore, but individuation was Jung's idea of self-realization. This is Jung's format or framework for how to become a self-realized person, which is both the goal and the process in analytical psychology. As we individuate, it's the process of becoming self-realized, and it's the goal of becoming self-realized. And it's a little bit implicit in this material. That's why I want to mention it, that, you know, for Jung, I believe what he's introducing here is meant for us as a framework to become more self-realized, and ultimately from a Jungian modality, more complete, more whole people. This is sort of the underlying message here. So for Jung, there are 2 attitudes, extroversion and introversion, which we'll get into. And then there are 4 functions, which are thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. And from the Jungian framework, there's 8 types. Okay, it's different than Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs, there's 16 types. For Jung, the way you get a type is by your dominant function, essentially, you would say in Myers-Briggs, your dominant function, and whether that dominant function is expressed introverted or extrovertedly. And that's it. So if I'm an extroverted thinker primarily, that's my type. If I'm an introverted intuitive person primarily, that's my type. It's all based on the dominant function and whether it's expressed introvertedly or extrovertedly. And everything kind of builds off of that. But ultimately, that means you can be an extroverted or introverted thinker, extroverted or introverted feeler, extroverted or introverted sensation type, or extroverted introverted intuition type. There are the 8 types right there. So what Jung has to say about this, he gives he doesn't give a lot of practical examples in his writing, but sometimes he does, and I really like to capture them because it's very helpful. So when Jung was thinking about types, he posed it in another way. Okay, another way to look at this is by asking the following question: how does a person react to an obstacle? That's the primary question. And the example he gives is when a person comes upon a brook where there is no bridge. There's the obstacle. So one person will say he jumped the brook for fun, another because there was no alternative, a third because they like to overcome all the challenges they meet, a fourth did not jump because they hate useless effort, and a fifth refrained because they felt no urgency in crossing to the other side. So the idea is they've all come across the same situation, right? The same objective reality, which is the brook without the bridge. And yet their reaction to that objective reality is quite different. The difference is not the situation. The difference is their habitual attitude. That's the difference. It's a very inside-out approach of looking at the world around us, right? So if we take this example and we put it into the functions, I'm leaving introversion and extroversion out of this for now. We could say if I'm a thinking-oriented person and I encounter this brook, I might use rational logic to decide how to proceed by looking at it very impersonally with a sort of cool-headed logic and using my rational principles to make a decision how to proceed. That's how I might approach that situation. If I'm a feeling-oriented person, I'll approach the situation in a more personal way, in the sense of whether jumping over the brook is agreeable or not to me, what such an endeavor is worth to me, and whether to accept or reject such a challenge. If I'm a sensation person, I'll look at my sensory experience in regard to crossing the brook. I'll try to build off my practical experience in related situations in the past and use that information in the here and now to inform a decision, how to move forwards. And if I'm an intuition-oriented person, I'll look at the brook problem in terms of future possibilities, patterns, and probably follow my hunch, whatever hunch comes up for me in regards with how to proceed with crossing or not. So here's an example of how a function might apply to coming across a problem and how they might look quite different, even if the problem looks the same. You know, this was what I realized when in the Spider-Man orchestra, was that it was like that realization of we were all in this, not only were we in the same physical space, it was like we had the same job. We were doing the same job in the same physical space, and yet we were emphasizing and de-emphasizing quite different things. You know, it might be worth just using one of my very high-tech assistant things I have here. So I made a little chart. It's basically a cross if you're listening to this, or a plus sign. This is how Jung sort of presents the types in some of his writings, where the placement of things is all arbitrary. But I've got thinking at the top, feeling at the bottom, intuition on the left, and sensation on the right. What I like to think about is imagine like if this is a valley, okay? So it's like a valley with a circular mountain range around it. If I'm a very strong thinking type, this is in the foreground for me, right? The thinking material is in the foreground of this valley, and the feeling material is in the background. If I'm a feeling type and I'm looking in on this valley, the feeling stuff is in the foreground and the thinking is in the background. It's literally the opposite when you think of foreground and background. And it's quite the same with sensation and intuition. The foreground and the background on the one hand becomes foreground and background on the other hand. So it's literally seeing things in some cases very differently. We'll come back to that chart later because there's more to say about that. But ultimately, what Jung was saying is that we have a habitual reaction to our life circumstances, a habitual response, and that response is primarily coming from, in regards to psychological type, our attitude and our dominant function, primarily. And that habitual reaction is our conscious relationship to how we make decisions and take in information in our lives. So one question to bring up that's worth bringing up is where this lands in terms of nature versus nurture. I'm sure that those of you who are familiar with Myers-Briggs and perhaps Jung, this is something to think about. Where does it come from our environment? Is it learned, our function and our attitude, or is it something that we're born with? The Jungian framework is that on some essential level, it's inborn. It's inborn. So specifically in terms of introversion and extroversion. In fact, he uses the point that it plays a sort of biological factor in the history. I'm going to see if I can find this in my notes. So there's a biological basis for this difference in attitude. This is the nature side of things. And he points to two different ways that species adapt to reality, right? So the one consists of a high rate of fertility with low powers of defense and short duration of life for the single individual. There he's describing the roots of extroversion. And the other consists in equipping the individual with numerous means of self-preservation, plus a low fertility rate. And there he's describing the roots of introversion. So extroversion hypothetically comes from an adaptation to reality, long-standing adaptation to reality that emphasizes a high rate of propagation, a short lifespan, and less means of defense. And meanwhile, introversion hypothetically comes from more means of defense and lower propagation. So the extroverted thing is to be facing and throwing oneself into the world and into relation with the world. And the introverted thing is actually quite more to withdraw one's attention and energy and to protect it and go inwards. And Jung would say there's a biological basis to this. In fact, I wonder if I should show you this. I'm just going to read this. This is like a Jungian excerpt just to show you how challenging this can be for me to read at times. The way he talks about this is his quote. This is the actual foundation of our two modes of adaptation. The nature of the extrovert constantly urges them to expend and propagate themselves in every way, while the tendency of the introvert is to defend themselves against all demands from the outside, to conserve their energy by withdrawing it from the outside world, thereby consolidating their own position against the outside world. The one achieves its end by a multiplicity of relationships, the other by monopoly. So that's his way of talking, which is amazing, but sometimes challenging for me to read. And it's a bit academic, but if you look at that, it's quite interesting to say that there's this sort of nature dimension of extroversion and introversion. He also goes on to say that it's randomly distributed, right? So regardless of our parents, we don't necessarily inherit the attitudes of our parents. It's distributed randomly. He says more about this, but I don't know that it's important right now. So in that sense, there is a nature dimension. However, he also makes the case that an environment can be very, very influential, very, very influential. So even if we have a natural disposition in regards to attitude and a dominant function, if we're in an environment that really opposes it, we may adapt. And he says it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of perhaps being fatigued, being a little bit confused later in life. And von Franz, another Jungian, describes this as the distorted type. So we can adapt, but in essence, there is a nature dimension, and life actually is quite a bit easier if we stick to that. So while I'm on the extroversion thing, actually, and introversion thing, I'm going to show you this other high-tech graphic that I developed here. There's a point of Jungian thought, which is, it's worth saying up front, it takes into account consciousness and unconsciousness. This is something I don't hear much of in the Myers-Briggs world, other than being in the grip or the inferior function. Conscious versus unconscious is extremely relevant from the Jungian point of view. You know, the whole idea is that we have a total personality. I don't know if you can see this. We have a total personality, and our ego is right smack dab in the middle of it in my drawing. That's not necessarily true to size, if you can believe that. But the ego is inside the total personality, and the total personality includes all that is conscious, all that is unconscious. And in this case, we're talking about extroversion and introversion. So introverted and extroverted energies exist in the total personality. And the way I like to think of this is, like imagine a moon, like a full moon shape, right? So if you divide the total personality right in half there, like a vertical line that's right from the top to the bottom, it goes through the smaller ego circle that's in the middle. What you would do is move the right half to the left and the left half to the right, and you get this kind of picture. So this is how I think of it in a visual form. It makes it quite easy for me to sort of understand that these are the two halves. You know, I don't know why I launched into the unconscious versus conscious thing, because that's not quite appropriate here. But in this case, we have introverted versus extroverted. So in the introverted side, you have the inner landscape. Okay, so you have the inner landscape. We'll talk more about what this means in terms of Jungian thought, but it's where abstraction comes from. It's where ideas come from. It's where the inner contents are. And then you have the extroverted world, which is the outer landscape. And this is where empathy comes from, where relationships come from, and how we sort of live in the outer world. This seems kind of arbitrary, but I'm going to explain like how it helps me. When you shift the half circles in this way, you get a sense of, right, the ego is still here, right, in the middle. But a person who's primarily extroverted is going to be living in this world consciously. Consciously, this is the world that they live in. So their primary experience, conscious experience of life, takes place in relationships. You know, extroversion is all about sort of relating to people and things. So this is where their conscious life is taking place. And essentially what happens is their energy comes from people and things in the external environment. This is where they get energized. and their attention goes into the outer world, the people and things. So they live in this world. This is where they're getting their energy, relationships to people and things in the outer world, and it's where their attention is going. This is their landscape, right? So what's so amazingly insightful about this fact is, if you think back to the graph, the valley of the different functions, it's not that this doesn't exist. It's that the person is not as conscious of this material. They're not as conscious. This is where the unconscious is. So as they move more and more into an extroverted landscape, they're less and less connected to their inner contents, to their inner world. So it's at the expense. As the conscious orientation becomes more and more extroverted, they become less and less connected to their inner world. That's the cost. Okay. Now for introverted, it's exact opposite. Introverted landscape is over here, in where the attention goes inwards and the energy comes from inwards. You know, we think of like extroverts as being very outgoing and fun and gregarious and things like this, and introverts as being shy and not as social. I mean, that's kind of true, but it comes from this. It's because for an introvert, their energy, where they get energized, comes from their inner world, and where their attention goes is back to their inner world. So you can see, even a strong introvert makes their way out. Actually, I'm going to add a line in the middle because this is actually going to help in terms of what I'm about to say. If you include the line down the middle, you can say that this is the line between inner and outer world that we all have. We all have that line. It's where it's the divide between what's going on inside of us, what's going on outside of us. Okay, for an introvert, they cross over the line into the outer world, but see, not too much. It's just brief. So the energy comes from their inner world. They take the contents of the outer world, but it retreats back into their inner world. That's the introverted experience. And the extroverted experience is the opposite. They do, with their energy and with their relationships, there is a degree to which that stuff, breaks through and goes into their inner world, but not so much. It goes right back into the outer world. So a extrovert is always in danger of growing his or her relationships outwardly in terms of business and with people, at the expense of being connected to themselves. So extroverted pursuits, we can lose our connection to ourselves on a deep level. And of course, it's the same in an introverted world. A person can get so absorbed in their inner material that they lose connection to outer reality. They lose connection to relationships, to the outer world. So what's so interesting about this is the Jungian idea is, it's not that we don't have the other half. It's not that extroverts don't have introverts. Well, actually, I should say something first. My understanding of the Jungian framework is that it's a little bit simpler in terms of the types, because it's sort of like you're primarily expressed extrovertedly or you're primarily expressed introvertedly. It's not like, one function is this way, one function is this way, one function is this way. You may have more extrovertedly expressed functions and more introvertedly expressed functions. That's true. But to me, the primary idea is your total personality is either more consciously extroverted or it's more consciously introverted. And you have one dominant function. That's sort of the Jungian framework. But the reason I say that again is because it's not that an extrovert doesn't have introversion or an introvert doesn't have extroversion. It's just that it's unconscious. It's just that it's operating unconsciously. So the Jungian thing is to say, when something's unconscious, we experience it as fate. We experience it in our relationships. We experience it in our work. We experience it in patterns. So the stuff that's unconscious, we experience it as fate. And I have a quote about this. It becomes, in other words, the unconscious stuff compensates for our conscious attitude. So an extrovert who, let's say, loses themselves in too much extroversion, their unconscious will compensate for that fact. It will compensate for that fact in such a way as to bring them back to themselves. Sometimes these things are very painful when they happen. And an introvert who gets too absorbed in themselves, the unconscious will compensate to continually bring them up against the world in some problematic way. This is another place where Jung has an example, and I'm going to try to find it in my notes, about a printer. It's actually kind of a fascinating story. I guess I can remember it by heart. But essentially, Jung tells a story of a printer who started as an employee in this printing company. This is a very extroverted person, by the way. He started as an employee in this printer company, and then worked very hard and worked his way up and became the owner of this printing shop. And it was at the expense of his introverted self, right? Because he was so connected to his work pursuits. He was so connected to his job, expanding the business, growing his stature within the business. That was where his conscious energy was going. So his introverted attention to his inner world was quite missing. So around this time, where he had become the owner of the shop, he started having these memories emerge where he remembered as a child, he would do drawings and paintings. And it was an intrinsic practice for him. It was an intrinsic practice. He just enjoyed to do such a thing. But he missed the call to action there, right? The call to action was his unconscious saying, hey, spend some time to do the things that are just come from your inner world that you love doing intrinsically, that bring you joy, that bring you life. Spend some time there. He missed it because his orientation was so extroverted. He thought, how can I take my artistic impulse that's coming up and apply it to my business and add some artistic sense to the printing that I'm doing? And the problem there was his artistic introverted side was so far away. It was so infantile and archaic because he had not spent time consciously pursuing it, that when he just applied it to his business, it eventually made his business go to pieces. It was such the wrong idea that it ruined the business. So the unconscious will bring up the parts of our life that we're missing, but it doesn't always mean to just apply it to where you're at in your life. The Jungian approach to such a thing is what he calls active imagination, where we take some time to explore the other functions, right? So let me think about how to say this. Ultimately, what was missed in this printer example, by the way, was the component of play, right? The component of fantasy and play. He didn't have space for that. That just got usurped by his extroverted business mentality. But the active imagination thing is to say, okay, let's say you're a thinking type, right? What's going to happen is primarily when you encounter a problem in business or in relationship, you're going to try to solve it with your thinking function. Now, if you suddenly decide, oh gosh, I want to employ more feeling function in my relationships in my life, it doesn't mean that suddenly your feeling function is going to jump up and operate at the same level as your thinking function. It's going to be quite lesser developed, right? Always our inferior function is the opposite of our dominant function. So you kind of have to spend some time just playing with it. And Jung's recommendation for such a thing is active imagination, where you create a safe space. And he recommended painting for his patients, but you can dance, you can write, you can do whatever really is right for you. But the point is, you have to let your thinking function go. You have to release it a little bit, right? Because for the feeling function to come up, it's going to be quite lesser developed. So a lot of times people go through a midlife crisis. It's what Jung calls an enantiodromia. Okay, so somebody who's a thinking type finally exhausts their thinking function and they just flip it and they live out of their feeling function. But it's going to be archaic. It's going to be infantile. It's going to be an undeveloped function, even if it becomes at the foreground. So the thing to do is how to incorporate more feeling into the total personality, which means you have to suspend your dominant function. You have to suspend it. This has to be let go of to such a degree that the inferior function can come up and play. So whether you're painting or you're dancing, you want to be in a space where you have more flexibility to draw on your intuition, to draw on your sensation, your feeling, your thinking, and in such a way that it's not at risk to your life, right? It's like a private place to go, the active imagination, to explore the functions in such a way that you can be with the lesser developed functions, and there's not going to be really problematic consequences in your work or in your relationships. That was the problem with the printer. The printer had that opportunity to spend some time with his artistic self, his creative self, and go inwards with it, but instead threw it into his work, and it was actually very problematic. It wasn't meeting in the middle. It was just lowering his ability to function at the business level. So that's the unconscious conscious side of it, is the unconscious will compensate for what we have conscious, but you know, we have to do it with caution. I think there's an aspect of we have to do it with caution. You know, the other aspect is not always to do it directly, right? So if I'm just sticking with thinking type because thinking is at the top, but in other words, often, and this relates to Myers-Briggs, if you have if you're thinking and your secondary function, as you say in Myers-Briggs, is intuition, for example, easiest thing if you want to explore your total personality and you want to move towards wholeness is to go to sensation as an intermediary step and then kind of spend time with feeling, right? So you don't just jump into your inferior function. And it works for all the functions in that way. If you're a sensation function, but you also use thinking, you're going to want to explore feeling before you dive right wholesale into intuition. That's sort of a way of taking it slower also. Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to say about all of this. I think, I guess I might just add while we're here, a quick description of the functions. I meant to do that earlier. You know, a person who's habitually thinking is going to use thinking to navigate the world. That's usually impersonal, following principles in their decisions. Feeling types, oh, I did want to say this. Feeling types make decisions using personal criteria, right? So it's valuation based and it's harmony based. They often think about how decisions affect others. And feeling is such a great function in the sense that Jung talks about how these words are a little bit arbitrary, right? The words point to the patterns of the empirical experience of the functions of psychological types, but they're just pointing to the patterns. They're just words, right? So I believe it was Jung himself who said somewhere that if you wanted to use the word valuing function instead of feeling function, you could. And I do that. I prefer that. To me, the feeling function is a valuing function. Although it is relational, it's very much about what something is worth, whether it's agreeable or not, whether to accept or reject it. It's a valuing function. So I like that. It makes more sense to me than feeling, which has a lot of associations that are confusing. Onto sensation. A sensation type experiences through the senses, very present-oriented and data-driven, and intuitive types experience through the unconscious. There's a wonderful picture in the Tavistock lectures from Jung where he has the functions sort of going from outer to inner, outer world to inner life. And sensation is first because sensation is really engaging with the outer world. Then thinking is second. You know, Jung says sensing tells us that something is, thinking tells us what it is, feeling tells us what it's worth to us, whether it's agreeable or not, to accept or reject it. And intuition is the closest to the inner life, right? Intuition is the closest to inner life. And it's a way of perception via means and ways of the unconscious. It's actually perceiving through the unconscious is what intuition is. So more simply stated, it's usually future-oriented, possibility-oriented, has to do with pattern recognition, and generally it has to do with perceiving things that are not rational to perceive. So having a capacity to see around corners, psychologically speaking. That's the intuition function. So gosh, I mean, I really struggled to get all this material. It's just such a scope of material. I was using Jung's psychological types, von Franz's lectures on typology, Modern Man in Search of His Soul, and then some Myers-Briggs literature. And what I realized is it's just a very wide scope. So hopefully I've touched on some things that are helpful or have some nuance or some new thoughts for you. And I'll be very curious what questions come out of this. And if there's interest to explore this more, if you do want to explore it with me, of course, I'll say again, I'm available. I do consultations and coaching that's heavily informed by Jung. So I'm easy to reach. Aiden at aidenmoore.com. It's AIDEN at aidenmoore.com. And I'd love to connect with you. So I will turn it back over to Shrikant.
Right. Aiden, this was amazing. You know, I've seen many, many different presentations. I've been following this for some time. And I think the way in which you brought back the insights of Jung is just amazing. Particularly, my favorite was one kind of at the end where you say intuition is perceiving through unconscious, but there are just so many gems throughout. So fantastic. So folks, now we're going to go to Q&A. We've got 4 rules. Number 1, type exclamation mark when you want to ask a question. At this stage, you're taking only questions, so no comments, just brief questions, because there are a lot of people on the call. I want to get to as many different questions as possible. Okay, so only questions. After the Q&A, we are going to go into breakout rooms of about 6 to 8 people. That's when we'll get to discuss these ideas in great amount of detail. And then we're going to be able to come back. And that's when you can give your comments. You'll get to talk about your takeaways and ask further questions. Okay, so that's the plan. So it's going to be, let me see. I'm going to start with David, Leslie, and Bob. David, go ahead.
This is David. All right. How much of Briggs-Myers is situational? Varies by situation. For instance, leading Zooms, I am extroverted. And all other areas are introverted. So I think it's highly variable. What is your view?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's definitely a situational aspect to all of this. And there's also the idea that we show up in different contexts in different ways. And I think that's what you're kind of speaking to. So when you know, in a certain condition, you're operating in a certain habitual way, and a different condition, maybe it's a different habitual way. I think the Myers-Briggs and also the Jungian thing is to sort of look at what's the most natural, like what really feels where your energy and your attention naturally go. That's almost independent of situation. But that being said, it has also been my experience that the situation changes how I show up and how other people show up.
Okay, next up is Leslie.
Hi, great talk. Thank you so much. When you were describing the valley and you were referring to those different functions as the foreground or the background, I got another image, and I wonder if you think this fits. You're in the bottom of the valley and you need to get to the rim, you need to get to the top. And there are an infinite number of paths, and your path could be in any of those 4 quadrants. And your path will take the route that is most comfortable to you based on your top 2 preferred functions. What do you think?
I love that. And I love the exploration of being in the valley, right? Because that's truer to life. I think you're onto something there. When I use the valley metaphor, it's like an extreme example, right? So it's like somebody who's gone all the way into the feeling function. But in truth, nobody's really done that. There's no pure feeling types, pure thinking types, pure sensation types. We're all kind of in the valley, exactly like you're saying, and kind of in the process of navigating it. But it helps as an example to see an extreme type in the sense of, as far as I lean, I didn't say this, but this might also answer your thought. It's like, as far as I lean into my thinking function is as far as I'm currently leaning away from my feeling function. Those are directly related. So if I go all the way to thinking, I've gone all the way away from feeling, and that's catastrophic in life. But in real life, you're absolutely right. We're kind of in the valley somewhere figuring it out, I think is so true.
Next up is going to be Bob, Jean, Jessica, Nathan, and Hiro. Bob, what's your question?
Aiden, I think you mentioned that there are 8 cognitive functions. Do you think that they can all be made conscious to some degree? I know there's a preference for the top one, but that's the question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in the Jungian framework, the idea is that we all have an inferior function, and that the inferior function stays inferior, generally speaking, through a lifespan. So what's interesting about that fact is that the inferior function is the one that's most colored by the unconscious. It's most colored by the unconscious. So in other words, if a person wants to dig into their unconscious material, where they're going to most probably first encounter it is in their inferior function. So on the one hand, there's a challenge there. It's sort of like, well, we can never bring our inferior function up to the level of our dominant function. But on the other hand, it's like, that's great, because it's a wellspring throughout life to continue to go deeper, to continue to see what's happening in the unconscious.
Next up is going to be Jean, Jessica, and Alicia. Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a great presentation. My question is, so you mentioned there is actually a physical character or to decide you extrovert or introvert or thinking or feeler. So do people change, or do you mind, like I'm a thinker, so I actually use I think therefore I am. I wonder if that help to form my more thinking directions, or is that I born with that, so I attract to that kind of word?
Will you repeat the question in terms of how that?
So it's like is that because our personality all transform when we grow up. I think I was very sensitive and different. I think very different from I'm now. So I'm ENTP right now. So I just wonder. I think it's the book I read, something transformed my idea, which transformed my personality. So I wonder, is that like nurture and nature? So do I born with this kind of personality, or do I make it into this personality?
You know, it's hard to say, to answer that question definitively. I'm not sure. It's a good question, but I don't know, because in my mind, I could see either being true. It could be that perhaps you adapted to, as this happens to many people, adapting to an early life environment that's not supportive of the natural tendencies. So adapting, and then later in life, you know, coming back to your natural tendencies. That's definitely something that happens. Or, you know, I guess there's 2 other options. There's also the idea of type development, which is talked about in Myers-Briggs. And that type development can happen over time, where different things, like what somebody else was asking about the valley, being in the valley, it's like, you know, you get more experience in other functions and you bring them more into your personality. So there is a developmental aspect. And lastly, people also have what Jung talked about as vital spiritual experiences that really shake things up. There's some cases where people really are one way at some point in their life, and something happens and they're quite different. So, you know, in your case, it could be any of those 3, and I'm not sure.
Excellent. Thank you. Next up is Jessica, Nathan, and Jairo. Jessica. Okay, so she asks, how can one cultivate pattern recognition? Is this related to intuition or other functions?
Yeah, pattern recognition, I would say, is very related to intuition, and how to cultivate it. You know, I can give you, since you're asking a direct question, give me 1 second. I'll be able to get a resource for you. Hang on. Apologies for the awkwardness there, but there's a that you can get this as a Myers-Briggs practitioner, type dynamics and development. So to experience introversion, there's a list of things, and I'll just give you a couple of them. Select an inner image, a picture that occurs frequently in your mind, or an analogy that you're drawn to a lot. Have a dialogue with this image. visualize it, and then say, tell me about yourself. Notice the pictures and stories in your mind. Select a normal everyday object or events like a fall leaf or a thunderstorm and write about it without giving any physical descriptions. So what mood does it create? Larger implications. I'll give you one more. Think of all the possible things to do on a Saturday and select one that you would normally not consider doing, like some new activity or place to go. Invite someone you would not normally spend time with to join, and describe it with so much enthusiasm that they'll join, then do it with energy. So, you know, reach out to me if you want more suggestions. I can give you more suggestions from that. I'm happy to just do that. And again, Aiden at aidenmoore.com. And I'd like to sit with that question, but that's my initial answer.
Wonderful. So folks, just want to remind you that we're going to do breakout rooms after this. Please bring up your participants panel. And if you are familiar with MBTI and Jungian function, click on yes. And if you're not, click on no. So that way I'll be able to arrange the breakout rooms a little bit better. Okay, so it's going to be Nathan followed by Jairo. Nathan, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Sorry if this question is a bit off topic, but you mentioned that you worked as a musician before, and I was wondering if you could speak to music in relation to MBTI preferences or to the Jungian functions. Like, for instance, other people in the industry or other musicians, did you notice that there were more people of a certain type? Or how did you use the music to express different functions, for instance?
Yeah. It's funny, you know, I've thought about this question, and it's, for me, I wonder in terms of how much MBTI applies to my music trajectory. It's almost like there, but also in the background. Speaking of foreground and background, I've noticed a lot of NFs in music. I've noticed some SFs, a lot of my friends wind up being ENFPs, ENFJs that are musicians. In terms of how type plays a role, extroverted feeling is so much related to the arts, right? In terms of like doing something that contributes to community, to society at large through an artistic endeavor. That's a very extroverted feeling function. So I think it's there. I think there's an element of it. I will say, as an aside, in my case, what was so funny is my sensing function is quite low. It's pretty underdeveloped. But when I worked on Broadway, it forced me to develop it, not so much in terms of music, but I had to show up on time. I had to wear all black. I had to play the same music over and over again. And this really helped my sensation function. So that was one of the biggest experiences I had in terms of music and Myers-Briggs, other than just first taking a test there and sharing it with my friends. Yeah.
Wonderful. Next up is Jairo followed by Joel. Jairo.
Thank you, Aiden. It helps me the way Carl Jung looks at it, like the four, and then it's either extrovert or introvert. But I heard something that you said about intuition. It's more like in the inner world of the person. Then what happens when you have an extrovert intuition type?
Yeah. So intuition can definitely be expressed primarily introverted or primarily extroverted. Introverted is the type that Jung says is the hardest to describe, because introverted intuition is so, it's not only inward, it's perceiving through the unconscious, the inward world. You find mystics in this category, and people who go very deep in terms of spiritual practice and things like this. Extroverted intuition is more about like seeing possibilities, being future oriented. It can be finding meanings and patterns in the world, what could be possible in the world. It's like you see something comes in front of you and you immediately imagine what it could become and what you could do with it. That's a very like introverted kind of attitude.
Thank you. Next up is Joel. Joel, go ahead.
Not introverted attitude. That's a very intuitive attitude. Sorry.
Go ahead, Joel.
Is that me, Shrikant?
Yes.
That was a mistake. I meant to click on yes, and I clicked on my hand by
Okay. All right.
If I can ask a relatively flippant question, since we know George is a New York Yankees fan, what type is he?
Do you know your type, George?
I'm a Mets fan.
Okay, so that is, it shows
mistake.
how difficult it is to tell types. So Aiden, I want to ask you one question,
Yeah.
which is about, like most people who, kind of think in terms of MBTI use the dominant function and the second function. So two functions in order to do that. You've talked about Jung primarily using the dominant function. So I want to talk about, what's the difference between it. So let's take extroverted intuition. If somebody's extroverted intuition is their dominant function, how would Jung think about that? And how would they what is the advantage or disadvantage of thinking in terms of NEFI and NETI as two different types versus just thinking that any dominant?
Well, will you say the last part of the question again?
You mentioned that Jung primarily thinks about the dominant function.
Yeah.
Somebody's dominant function is any, then he would say, okay, this is any person, and try to understand that person through that function. Now, like most people who practice MBTI, they would use two functions. They would say any dominant and either TI or FI as a supporting function. And they would think of people in terms of any TI as one category and any FI as one category. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of either looking at only in terms of one function and looking at in terms of pair of functions?
Yeah, I understand. It's a tricky question. Advantages versus disadvantages. I would say what's the advantage of the Myers-Briggs approach is that it's very succinct. It's easy. It's easier to digest, and you can apply it. You can apply it quite quickly, right? It's sort of like once you understand the four letters, you get a lot of information, and it helps to think of in some ways it gives a whole picture quite quickly, to use the Myers-Briggs approach, which I appreciate on the one hand. On the other hand, I think Jung in some cases warns against having too theoretical of a framework in any regard, including anything, but in this case, including Myers-Briggs, because Jung's whole thing was, he talked about this in terms of his therapy, to learn all the theories, learn all the techniques, but when you're in front of another individual, and he was talking about like a patient, to just be one soul in front of another soul. That's so I think Myers-Briggs sometimes misses that fact. So the Jungian thing is to say there's more gradients and there's more individuality than can fit into this Myers-Briggs structure, right? That theory. And I think Jung wants us to be very present to these other, it's quite an abs. So it's, the people who made Myers-Briggs are intuitive types, right? So this makes sense. Introverted intuitives, primarily, I think. So this makes sense because it's about pattern recognition and it's about abstraction. Wonderful. So it works to abstract it and make it to focus on the similarities. It focuses on this. In other words, I'll say one last thing. The Myers-Briggs thing focuses on the similarities and minimizes the differences. Okay. Jung does not do that. Jung makes a lot of room for differences.
Wonderful. I thought that was good. I think my take is that I think Jung is far more cognizant of the magnificence and the complexity of a human being. And he does not dumb it down just to make it easy. We'll say, okay, just try to actually grasp what is going on. Though it is messy, it is better to be messy and vague and even have some contradictions than to lose the picture of what is going on. Is that a fair way of saying?
It's a totally fair way, and I think accurate way of saying it. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see. Okay, so I'm about to start the breakout rooms. This is your last chance to tell me whether you know MBTI or not. I'm starting the breakout rooms in just a minute. Okay, any closing thoughts before the breakout rooms? Can you go ahead and put your email address and what you do, etc., in the chat again?
Sure.
We'll be starting the breakout rooms shortly. I'm just setting it up. Welcome back, folks. Welcome back, everybody. Aiden, are you here?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, excellent. So folks, now it's time for takeaways. So what we're going to do is each person will get 1 minute to talk about their takeaways. You can also put your question on the, if you have big question, but make it count. Put down the biggest, most interesting question you have. But so you can talk about your takeaways and put a question. You have only 1 minute because there are about 60 people on the call. So we want to make sure that as many of you who would like to speak can speak. So we'll just run through as many people as possible. I'm going to call on people in the order in which I see them in Zoom. If you want to skip, you can just say skip or just be silent. I'll just go to the next person. So I'm going to start with Jennifer, Donna, and Ashley. What is your takeaway, and do you have a question? And we'll keep track of all of this, and then Aiden can respond to any of the questions at the end after everybody has spoken. Okay. So Aiden, what I would recommend is just choose few themes that are repeated that people keep bringing up. And we have also want to remind people that we have got an amazing meetup at 5 o'clock. We've got more than, I think it's going to be close to 10 people of various types talking about their approach to MBTI, how they use MBTI in their life. Okay, so it will be a good companion piece to this. So it's going to be Jennifer, Donna, and Ashley. Jennifer, what's your takeaway?
I'm gonna skip. Thank you.
Okay, it's too many people, so I won't be able to see skip. So if you don't want to talk, you just say remain silent. I'll just go to the next person. It's going to be Donna, Ashley, and Laura. Donna.
So in our breakout group, we touched upon whether Myers-Briggs, I guess the community doesn't take it, psychology community doesn't take it seriously, but I find it to be very useful. In the work environment, we had the whole team. We knew each other's Myers-Briggs, and it helped to understand the behavior.
Excellent.
Teammates. So I found it very helpful.
Thank you, Donna. Next up is Ashley, Laura, and Barry. Ashley, what's your takeaway?
Well, being a thinking type, I haven't had the time to think about a question, but I would agree with Donna. I think that last spoke that it's a good tool to use for behavior. And that was one of the questions that was asked. Maybe you can expand upon it. And that's my question, that they were wondering, is it used in the psychological world? And from my understanding, but I'm not in that area,
Go ahead.
I don't think it is.
Okay, thank you. Next up is, let's see, Laura, Barry, and George. Laura.
I don't have any.
Okay. Next up is Laura Crollard, Barry, and George.
I found it interesting. We were talking about kind of like, we went into philosophy, of course, in it, and it was just seeing that it's a strategy and not everyone, it doesn't work for everyone, and that's okay, was kind of my main takeaway.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Laura. Next up is Barry, George, and Jean. Barry.
Yes, well, I have the same question. Why does the psychological community not embrace Myers-Briggs. And my guess is why they don't is because it's an old theory. It's not based on a lot of science. And I think we're moved. And so my biggest question is, and I'd like for us to discuss, is there any effort being made to use the latest neurobiological studies using fMRI scans to determine different kinds of personality? I read a book about the blue brain, the blue Zen brain.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Barry. Appreciate that. Great question. Both observations and question. Next up is George, Jean, and Jeff. George.
Hey, Barry, I like that question. It's a good question. Hey, Aiden, good to see you. Great job. I'm not sure if I have a question, but perhaps it's embedded somewhere in what I'm about to say. You kind of mentioned earlier on regarding introversion, extroversion. And again, my comments is more towards a Jungian approach, not towards a Myers-Briggs approach. Regarding introversion, extroversion, I always found that fascinating. And I think someone asked you the question regarding, is it nature or nurture? You know, and personally, I'm not interested in that question. But I am fascinated in terms of how libido moves, how libido is constellated. In terms of introversion, how it's constellated towards the subject, and in extroversion, it's constellated towards the object. And it seems to me that most of us have a preference. And then how do we evolve by employing by incorporating the other attitude? You know, and I like how you expressed it, habitual response to life circumstances. And I think that may help to respond to my interest. Thank you.
Excellent, George. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next up is Jean, Jeff, and David. Jean.
Yeah, it's a great presentation. I really learned a lot from this one. And in our discussion, we're lucky to have someone who has experience in this. And actually, we were discussing when we text the extroversion or introversion, there's a percentage. And I think she mentioned it's not the percentage of extroversion or versus introversion. So it's actually how you identify with one of those. I'm just curious, your experience with this percentage, what exactly means.
Excellent. Jean, great to see you here. Next up is Jeff, David, and Kelly. Jeff?
Well, my takeaway is just how complex the topic is and how hard it is for people to know their type. It's just difficult, and it takes some time and learning, and there's a lot of misinformation, unfortunately, because of quick solutions, answers given out. So just that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Let's see. Next up is David, Kelly, and Francoise. David from LA.
Oh, yes. I was in the thinking and sensing group with Barry, and we want to know the scientific underscoring of Briggs-Myers now 80 years in. Okay. And you were suggesting that at the end, Shirkan, with its simplicity. But yeah, we want more scientific underpinnings before we proceed. And also, your next event is East Coast time. You talk 5 o'clock.
Yeah, 5 p.m. East Coast time. So that's going to be exactly. We're going to start about an hour from now, 60 minutes from now. So don't miss it. It's going to be incredible. Next up is Kelly, Francoise, and Ada. Okay, sorry. First Kelly. Kelly, go ahead.
My takeaway is the same as Jeff's. It's really complicated, and I thought I knew myself, and when I listened to the explanations, I didn't. And our group had this lovely discussion, and at the very end, we came up with the questions of how does gender and how does culture affect these personality types? And my mind was blown yet again. So, but the complexities delight me. So that's my takeaway. Thank you so much, Aiden.
That's a great response to complexity. Next one is Francoise, Ada, and Louise.
So,
Francois.
It's been really great, and I want to thank Aiden, because what has been mostly interested and learning is the relationship of what Briggs and Mayer did, starting from Jung, and how it evolved and the base of what they discovered or put together. So that was really clarifying something I didn't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Francoise. Next up is Ada, Louise, and Louis.
Okay, thank you, Aiden. Again, it was great presentation. So Betty and I focused more on the inferior function. We're both introverts. So, and then we also discussed the example that Aiden gave about, well, it was more like it came from a question on how to approach the inferior function, either by engaging with active imagination or other activities. It was very interesting.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Louise Potter, then Luis Del Pino, and then John R. Louise, go ahead.
Sorry, wasn't Rachel in our group? I'm not exactly following what's going on, sorry. I was in a group with Rachel, but I missed the presentation, so I'm not really sure what to say here, sorry.
Next up is Louis, John, and Bob. Louis. Louis, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was thinking, first of all, thank you for this great Zoom meeting that you host. I was invited by Jairo, my good friend. And MBTI is not my expertise, although I like psychology. I just wrote in the chat that I feel MBTI looks at the outside of the personality, the surface of the personality, whereas Jung looked at the core of it. And it's reminded me of the theories about the black hole, where all the data, all the information is on the surface, and there's nothing on the inside.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Louis. Great observation. Next up is John, Bob, and Rachel. John.
Yeah, thank you. I've had some distractions, so it's nice to be back. At one point, Joan in our group raised one point that I think is always worth mentioning. That really, when you take the Myers-Briggs test, things score on a scale, and some people test very extreme in one aspect or another, and some people test very close to the center. And so once you get a moniker thrown at you, for initials, even within those character groups, there can be a tremendous amount of variation. And so, and of course, the Myers-Briggs has always been considered an indicator, a suggestion, and it's helpful to the extent that you find it to be helpful in understanding things better.
Thank you, John, and great to have you back. Next up is Bob, Rachel, and Janine. Bob.
Okay, takeaway. I think that nothing is, whether you're mature or immature, nothing's more important than knowing what one is. And the MBTI is a clue. And I'm just astonished at how many people here are interested in the MBTI. I mean, they want to know about it. That's my takeaway.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. Next up is Rachel, Janine, and Nathan. Rachel.
Hi, thanks Aiden for the talk. And one idea that was new to me, like a new way to think about the functions, was in your answer to someone's question, like the degree you lean towards feeling, that's how much you lean away from thinking. So thank you for that new way to think about the functions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rachel. I've always found that very useful. Next up is Janine, Nathan, and Denise. Janine.
Hello, and thank you, Aiden and Shrikant, for facilitating this. Yeah, I have so many questions. There's so much to process. I think I probably just need to go away and, rather than have a question right now to ask. But I'm learning heaps. It's been really interesting. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Nathan, Denise, and Hiro.
I really like the diagram where you showed how different types like E and I types, we dip into different universes temporarily and then come back. And in terms of what people have been asking in terms of the scientific validity of it, I think one factor behind the lack of evidence is the sort of a chicken egg situation where if people don't think that there's any validity to this, they won't study it, and vice versa.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Nathan. Next up is Denise, Hiro, and Roger. Denise.
Thank you, Aiden and Shrikant. It was great, and I really enjoyed the breakout group as well. One of my takeaways was how much misinformation and lack of information is out there for people who have taken the MBTI, which is really sad to me, and I think adds to people not taking it as seriously as I wish they would, because it's so incredibly useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Hiro, Roger, and Maritza. Hiro.
Thank you, Aiden and Shrikant and everyone. I heard in the beginning, Aiden talk about feelings that to him, it made more sense, or it reduced the confusions if you thought of it as a values system kind of function. I was wondering if you could give an example of that.
Sure.
Understand it better. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is, let's see, Roger, Maritza, and Ashley. I don't see Roger over there, so I'm going to skip him. Maritza, Ashley, and Cheryl. Maritza.
Hi, I really liked Aiden's your portrayal with the mountains and the valleys, and I really like you showing the foreground versus the background, because what I'm hearing there is that you're saying just because you are predominantly thinking, it doesn't mean that the feeling disappears. It's still there. You still have it. It is still a tool in your toolbox. And I think at in my discussion group, it was something that came up, this concept of, this is something to guide you. It's not set in stone. Just because these letters say you're predominantly this way, the thing to remember is the word that precedes it is predominantly, or, in the foreground. And so my question is, how do we express to someone or to a group of people the caution that should go with using this type of a tool as a guide? Now, for example, somebody mentioned that it's used in a work environment in a group, because I see the possible danger of maybe pigeonholing someone. Like if I tell someone I'm INTJ, they're like, oh, well, she's rubbish at feelings, so let's not have her do this creative thing. And maybe that's not entirely true, because maybe you don't know that I'm a musician or something on the side. I'm not, but in case I were, I wouldn't want to be closed in. So that would be my question.
Excellent. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Ashley, Jeff, and Ashley, Cheryl, and Jeff. Ashley. Okay, next up is Cheryl. Okay, next up is Jeff. Don't know what's going on. Jeff, Sarah, and Joan. So Sarah, Joan, and Wayne. Sarah?
Hoping I'm the only Sarah. I think I'm still processing. There was a lot of information, but I think more than anything, I just want to express a sense of gratitude for everyone involved, and Aiden for giving a great presentation.
Thank you. Next up is Joan, Nari, and Robin. Joan. Okay, Nari, Robin, and Eric. Nari?
I want to say first, Aiden, thanks for a great presentation. I dig this stuff, so I always geek out to it. And I just love hearing other people's perspectives on something that I find fascinating. A good reminder for me was that to remember that classification and the way that the MBTI is kind of utilized now is maybe not the best method. I like the purity of Jung's method of getting back to the simplification of it and understanding that there's nuance with every person. And so just because somebody falls within this 4-letter category doesn't mean that they're a cookie cutter of another person who's going to fall within that same category.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you're preparing in New York Public Library for the next presentation. Appreciate that. Next up is Robin, Joel, and Betty. Robin.
Okay, just a couple of points. It's called the Myers-Briggs type indicator, with the emphasis on indicator, because Isabel Briggs Myers always wanted it to simply be an indicator of what your possible cognitive process preferences might be. And she said herself, it's meant to be a conversation starter. It's not meant to be relied upon. So that's an important point, that a lot of people take the MBTI results as gospel and they just sort of stamp it on their forehead and say, this is what I am, but it's not. It's simply an indication of what you might have as your cognitive process preference. The other thing is that the MBTI is accused of putting people in boxes, which a lot of people do. But of course, Jung's theory is very dynamic, and all throughout Psychological Types, the book, he talks about the dynamism of the cognitive processes and how everybody can and does use all 8 cognitive processes all the time, and we switch and swap between them as the situation warrants. So it's an important point to remember that the MBTI is not the be-all and end-all. It's merely a starting point into understanding how your cognitive processes work. I'll leave it at that.
Great observations. Thank you, Robin. Next up is Betty, Jennifer, and Kimberly. Betty.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thanks for a great talk. I was just wondering how much of the inferior function can we cultivate? And I was also wondering how much of the functions are nature and how much is nurture?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Betty. Next up is Jennifer, Kimberly, and Paulo. Jennifer. Okay, Kimberly. Okay, Paulo. So it's going to be Paulo, Anna, and Kevin. Paulo. Okay, let me see. Looks like I'm coming to the end of things here. So it's going to be Kevin, Mike, and anybody else who wants to speak. Just go ahead and now at this point, type an exclamation mark. Kevin, would you like to give your takeaways?
Yes, thank you. My takeaways, got a ton of question, also has my own observation. After this, the type of question we ask, let's see, for each person we do observation every day, learning then. We use different techniques we have, both. Let's say we use sensing or intuition, use thinking, feeling, judging, and perceiving at the same time. I'm not sure I'm right. And also my question is similar people mentioned before. What's the percentage of nurture or nature come from? What's the religion and the culture and age, gender, and background, work experience affect this personality? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. Next up is Mike and Rogine and Eric. Mike?
I think in my case, and probably in other people that I observed, it's situationally dependent. You have a different kinds of projects that you're on, or different family situations, or whether you're in a work situation, a colleague situation, or whether you're being audited by the IRS, and you put on a different hat and answer the questions a different way. And I think that when I'm during an implementation phase of a project, I'm ENTJ, And the emphasis on the J, we've made a decision and you got to make it work. INTP during the brainstorming phase, and an introverted phase during the family or friend phase. Or so the same problem occurs of being flexible and moving to a different dominant position with another system called the MMPI. And I don't know which phase to really adopt it, because I haven't seen a write-up on saying on how to really behave depending on the situational basis. I'd appreciate some comments on how you should adapt yourself to different situations.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Great as always. Next up is Regine and Eric. If anybody else wants to share their takeaways, go ahead and type an exclamation mark in Zoom. Regine, go ahead.
In our breakout group, I was struggling with the concept of you're leaning towards something and away from something. But anyway, one of the people who, I'm confused about what name, mentioned that you could think of it as being dominant hand, right hand versus left hand. And at the moment, my right arm, the dominant one, is in a sling, and I've been attempting to cut vegetables, and I recognize this feeling that it's just weird, which is kind of how I feel when I'm trying to operate in the mostly feelings arena. So I would suggest that as a helpful experiment.
Wonderful. Thank you, Regine. Great observation. Next up is going to be Eric, followed by Julie. Eric?
Oh, hi. I think my takeaway is the need, seeing the need for people to understand, to be made to understand that the percentage, the MBTI scores, the percentage figures are what's known as the clarity, the preference clarity index. It's not saying you're this percent introvert and that percent extrovert. It's how you're this percent clear on it. That's what that is, and that would help realize, that you're not. It's a matter of how much understand and when you're answering the test, and then it's not what you are, and also to realize that about whether the preferences can change, like the functions are connected to complexes. That's more of a deeper. That's like what BB kind of talks about, but that would help too. But first of all, that I guess people realize that it's a clarity of preference and not percentage. 1%, you're 1% this and that, another percent that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eric, for clarifying that, and looking forward to your participation at 5 o'clock. Next up is Julie. So Julie, what is your takeaway from this meetup, and do you have a question?
I just have a comment on my, when I've taken this test before, I had a problem with the questions. A lot of my answers were, it depends. And the reason for that is because there's a big difference. For example, are you organized? Well, that's a value and it's something I strive for. So I had a difficult time. That's like my ideal self is organized. But if you want me to talk about what I'm reflecting right now, it's not that. So I think that's a big distinction that gets missed by it.
Excellent comment. All right, folks. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to attempt to summarize what, or just recap what everybody has said, and then Aiden can respond to anything that he wants to respond to. So Donna pointed out that this is useful at work. Ashley, asked, why is it that this is not widely used in psychology? Barry pointed to the necessity of figuring out something that would be based on neurobiology or fMRI. George asked about how the libido is constellated for an introvert and an extrovert, and how you can go to the other side, how you can reach the other side. Laura talked about the fact that this is useful for some people, but not for others. Jean made the distinction between what you identify as and what you actually use in terms of functions. Jeff reminded us how hard it is and complicated it is to actually arrive at your own assessment of your personality. David, echoed the idea that, we need more scientific basis. Kelly was intrigued by how this varies by gender and culture. Francoise pointed out that Aiden provided the crucial understanding of the history of development of Myers-Briggs and its Jungian roots. Ada talked about how to approach inferior functions. Louise made the distinction between being able to see things on the surface by Myers-Briggs, whereas Jung reaches all the way deep down to the core of human beings and to show the entire complexity of it. John pointed out to the tremendous variations that exist in people and how they are actually constructed. Bob said that nothing is more important than knowing yourself, and he's glad to see so many people trying to do that. Rachel talked about this interesting idea that Marisa also talked about, that you can learn about what you're strong at by seeing what you lean away from. Nathan pointed out, and I second that, the excellent diagram, those intersecting circles with the ego in the middle. That was a very beautiful way of describing introverted and extroverted. Denise pointed, warned that there is a lot of misinformation out there. Jairo pointed to the fact that when Jung uses the concept feeling, he actually means value. That's a huge point that Aiden made, which I fully agree with. Maritza talked about the caution of jumping to conclusions based on kind of superficial measurements of people. Nari talked about, talked about many people who have cookie cutter approach and the perils of that. Robin also pointed out that this is an indicator only, and also pointed out the tremendous dynamism in the thinking of Jung, which does justice to what goes on in a human being. Betty asked how much of this is nature and how much is nurture, which also Kevin echoed. Mike pointed out the fact that a lot of our behavior is situational, and how do we deal with that in these measuring scales. Rogine pointed about is leaning towards the concept. I didn't get that fully. Eric, who also has tremendous experience with this, pointed out that the score that you get is your preference clarity, the clarity of preference, not that you are so much percentage this. And Julie also pointed out the confusion that people have between preference versus actual use that many other people pointed out. So that is a quick recap of the things that people talked about. So now I'm going to hand it over to Aiden. And Aiden, are there any questions or any themes you would like to focus on?
Yeah, let me look at my notes. I was taking notes as people's questions came up. And I think firstly, I just want to say thanks to everybody here for coming and being a part of the conversation. I really enjoyed the questions. I really enjoyed the breakout room. And it inspired me to further thought. And I just really enjoyed everyone being here. So first of all, thank you for coming, and Shrikant for hosting these events as you do. Really just such a wonderful thing to see and now to be a part of. So yeah, I'm just going to go down this list. How much time do we have, Shrikant, realistically, in terms of answering these questions?
Let's see, we've got about 15 minutes to wrap up. And then I want to give a little bit of break for people if they want to, grab something to eat or something like that. And then we will start the next one at 5 o'clock. So you have until 4:45. You've got 15 minutes.
Okay, great. I'll keep it within there. Okay, so Jairo, I don't know if sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right. Feeling as a valuing function, you wanted an example. So basically any decision that's made, like we would think of through the feeling function, I just conceive of it as a valuing function. And the reason I do that is because like Jung's description I can't remember if I shared this, but there's an interview in 1957 where Jung kind of makes it really simple. It's like sensing tells us that something is there, thinking tells us what it is, feeling tells us what it's worth to us, what it's worth, and whether it's agreeable or not, and whether to accept or reject it, right? Like he uses the word feeling, but you could use the word valuing there. Like, how much do I value this person? How much do I value this project? What's it worth to me? Do I want to accept it? Do I want to reject it? To me, the barometer of the decision in such a way has to do with its value as I experience it. So to me, I think of it as a valuing function in that sense. Like if I was, in other words, going to the brook again to cross the brook, if there was no bridge, using a valuing function, I might think, okay, what's it worth to get across? Is it agreeable to me to get across? More agreeable to stay here? Do I want to accept the challenge, reject the challenge? What's it worth it to me? That's the primary question almost. Does that answer your question?
No, let's not go back and forth, Aiden. We were going to run out of time otherwise.
You're right about that. Okay. That's a great question. You can email me. Anybody, if has further questions, aiden@aidenmoore.com. I'm really enjoying talking to you. So if it doesn't answer your questions, feel free to email me. Yeah, so Donna, helpful in the work environment. I've also found that. It's cool to see that that's working for you. To me, it's not only in terms of teams, but also in terms of communication, like understanding how a person is making decisions and expressing themselves. It's really fascinating. MBTI and psychological world. I saw some people posted the, there's a link somewhere in the chat of a psychological article that explains why MBTI is not looked at as scientific. I will say this, and to everybody who asked that question, because that seems like a big question, I'm coming from the Jungian framework. Okay, I am certified in Myers-Briggs, but my core system of thought, my framework is Jungian. That's my framework. So what I found from the Jungian framework is, once you get into qualitative data, which we get into in Myers-Briggs and in the functions, it's not quantitative, right? Like it's not a measurement of, you can't do it on a ratio scale. It's not measured in terms of quantitatively. It's qualitative, it's characteristics, it's personality. So once you get into qualitative measurements, it becomes very tricky. Like we can use the scale that Eric talked about, right? Like the clarity index, preference clarity index, to sort of make it quantitative. But the issue is, once something becomes qualitative, it becomes conceptual. It becomes conceptual. So all of these are conceptual explanations of qualitative experiences. And Jung would say very specifically the huge task once something becomes conceptual is to define your concepts very clearly. Whether or not that's scientific, it's almost sort of not my question. I don't know. But what I know is when we're talking about something, that's why, like in Jung's 6 collected works, psychological types, there's a whole section at the end that's just called definitions. And he just defines his terms, defines his terms, defines his terms to say, this is what I'm talking about. Does it work in empirical science, the way the scientific method as we use it? I don't know. That's not necessarily his point. He's saying this is what I'm talking about. So we have to define our concepts very clearly, whether it's science or not. MBTI is a strategy that doesn't work for everyone. That's so true. Laura, I was glad to see you here. I don't know if you're still here. Well, I'm sure we'll talk soon. Barry, people suggested Dario Nardi. That's the first person that came to my mind. And through Dario Nardi, you'll probably find other people in that world of neuroscience and MBTI. George, I mean, my dude, you're on it. Like the challenge is, oh, there you are. I mean, you're on it. It's just like for me, where the challenge comes in is like, if we talk about libido getting constellated or subject versus object, then it's sort of like, it's not language that everybody's going to get behind, just by virtue of the fact that like some people, that's not how they talk about these things. So that's why I use the words attention and energy, right? Because it is a libidinal gradient. It's naturally going to the introversion or extroversion, but it's the expression of that that disposition, that form. To me, the form of those dispositions are expressed, as I put it in common language, as where your attention goes and where your energy comes from. And it's a little more like conversational. So it's just sort of a, that's how I talk about it. How to evolve intro into extroversion, introversion, you know, that's the question, right? It's all of the, it's like how to evolve all the stuff. I'm sure that's an ongoing, we'll have an ongoing conversation around that for sure. Ging, my experience of the percentage of introversion versus extroversion, you know, I notice I have a lot of both in my life, but I relate better to introverts, I think. I wouldn't know about the percentage, to be honest. That's a very interesting question. In experience, I relate more to introverts, but I have both of them in my life. Almost equal parts would be my guess. How does gender and culture relate? It's hard to say, although probably more so in the nurture versus the nature. So I'll speak to that because there was a couple nurture versus nature questions. To me, again, the Jungian framework is that we have natural dispositions. So there's sort of an inborn quality around some of this stuff that seems to be the idea, the conceptual understanding from the Jungian framework. I would say that there's an inborn tendency certainly towards extroversion or introversion. That's the biological basis of Jung's idea around, you know, well, what I talked about, like propagation versus lifespan, these kinds of things. There's a biological component, and it seems to be nature. But in the environment, yeah, you're going to be affected by culture, you're going to be affected by your family, you're going to be affected by how your gender is received and responded to. And so I would say it's almost gets outside of the scope of MBTI for me. That just gets into basic adaptation that may involve the functions, but it's also just personality development in general. Surface personality versus core, I love that. I totally think Jungian is about the core. I also think when you think about the surface personality, what I get from that, and this is a very Jungian idea, is you're looking at the abstracted idea. You're looking at the abstracted, the surface generalized abstraction of, like, for example, 16 types, right? We can get a surface picture of what they all look like, but no two individuals are actually the same at the end of the day. If you really connect with an individual in front of you, there's nobody else that's ever been like them, and there's nobody else that will ever be like them. So Myers-Briggs doesn't touch on that. You'd have to have 8 billion types, right? So somewhere in there is this dichotomy of, like, okay, we fit into certain buckets, and yet each person is an individual. And the Jungian thing that gets to the core thing is, who are you as an individual? Related to your type, unrelated to your type, who are you as an individual? Jung tries to answer that question, beginning with type, but going much deeper than type. Yeah, looking for more of these. The chat said qualitative can be just as valuable as quantitative. It's so true. I struggle with, I don't do a lot of research, so that's nice to hear, actually, because I just took a statistics class and I kept trying to go into qualitative land, and my teacher didn't like that.
So Aiden, if you have handled all the questions, I have one question.
Sure, I've got a few more, but I'm at your disposal.
No, go ahead. You can finish up.
Nari, the 4 letters don't put people into a box. They're more complex. So true. That goes back to the Jungian versus MBTI. I really agree with you. It's very complex. And Maritza, I skipped this question about the caution part of using the tool. I agree with that. I mean, you seem very sensitive to this point. So how to caution people is just to say, you know, I think part of the Jungian conversation is to answer this question, to say that people are, you can put them into certain boxes, right? Whether we're talking about their dominant function from a Jungian, their psychological type from a Jungian point of view, or their type from a Myers-Briggs point of view, we can do that and put them into boxes. But at the end of the day, that doesn't define the person in front of you. It's just one way of conceptualizing them. I had a friend that was really into human design, and it used to really frustrate me. Everything I would say, she would say, oh, it's because this is happening in your human design chart. And I'm like, I felt invisible because it wasn't, we weren't relating. It was like between us was human design, and that's all she saw. And I hated that. I really disliked that. So it's like a tool, but the cautionary thing is to realize we are individuals, and the Jungian thing really speaks to that. Robin, I loved your points. Betty and Kevin, I think I spoke to this, but the environment, it affects how a person adapts, but there's usually an inborn quality, according to Jung, about type in terms of attitude and and function. And it also goes beyond the scope of MBTI, to be honest. Once you start talking about cultural influences and these types of things, it's beyond the scope of MBTI in some ways. I love the Rogin example, the dominant hand. They train an MBTI like that. It's so really helpful to see. Yeah, and last, the 5 preferences. Oh yeah, Eric made up some great points. I'm excited to hear more from him. John Beebe's thing of functions connected to complexes. I mean, there's so much more Jungian stuff, guys, just as a closing remark for me. I mean, the Jungian thing is so vast. I mean, we just touched on an early work of his and barely touched on it, but you get into complexes, the collective unconscious. There's so much to explore. So we're just the tip of the iceberg with this conversation. And Mike, how to adapt to different situations. I heard that question. It's tricky in the sense of, here's my question to you. Adaptation at the cost of what? Adaptation at the cost of what? If it's a matter of making the impression that you want, then yeah, of course, we're adapting all the time to make the impression we want in our environment. Meanwhile, the other question is, but who are you on some sort of intrinsic level away from trying to make an impression, right? So that's a very important question too. And I think Jung deals with that. Who are you on some fundamental level behind the impression you're trying to make? He calls it persona, right? So persona is the mask that we use to make the impression we want and to hide what's really going on. So both sides are true. What's the impression you want to make and how do you adapt to that? And what's really going on inside of you that's really true and maybe perhaps more consistent and constant, and how do you live that out? Equally important question. So I think that's the questions I have, Shrikant.
Okay, so just one final question as an overview question, because there are many people here who are very familiar with Myers-Briggs and relatively fewer people here who are familiar with Jung.
Yeah.
So if you want to summarize what study of Jung's take on this does for you in understanding Myers-Briggs, what are the points that you would highlight? Because it's clearly the roots of it lie in Jung, but most people are not going to the roots. So what, if you wanted to list the advantages of going back to the Jungian roots of Myers-Briggs, what are they?
Yeah, great question. So in some ways, let me just think of how to answer that. What is the purpose does it serve to go to the roots of the Jungian thing? What I find is it serves a great purpose that includes Myers-Briggs, but also quite beyond it, just in the sense of, you know, I think Jung's whole thing primarily was the psyche, the human psyche, and included the influence of the unconscious. So there's such a rich pursuit there in the Jungian framework that the psychological types touches on, but, and like Eric mentioned, complexes. I mean, in the Jungian world, we talk about dreams, we talk about complexes, we talk about fantasies, we talk about relationships, we talk about active imagination, spirituality. I mean, Jung, he differentiated himself from Freud and Adler in that his focus was the spiritual experience, the religious experience. That was for Jung a pivotal pursuit. So, you know, all of this stuff there's a lot going on in the Jungian world. And I think to explore it will benefit you regardless of MBTI, to be a more whole and essentially enlivened person, but more connected to yourself and more connected to the world. That's been my experience.
Wonderful. So let me add one thing, one thought here. I mean, one of the big ideas of Jung is the archetypes.
Yeah.
And the person who has actually taken both these ideas of psychological functions and archetypes and kind of married them together is John Beebe. And I find that his work, you know, those insights of saying, how do these work as archetypes gives you a far more, better understanding of the dynamics of what is going on than just measuring the functions. So that is one example of how kind of integrating more of Jung into your thinking can give you a much more powerful tool than what you had before.
It might be worth a couple of is there a particular book you would specifically recommend to this community?
We've done 3 meetups with John Beebe himself. So if you go to our YouTube channel and 52 Living Ideas, and look for John Beebe. There is a great presentation by Richard Owen, giving a great overview of John Beebe's work. And then John Beebe himself was there, so he has answered questions from that. That's the place I would start in order, because that's the most accessible work. I mean, I've read John Beebe's work. I've read one other work which does a fantastic job of summarizing his work, but I think this video is the most accessible way of getting started on that. All right, so Aiden, this was fantastic. I just simply loved your presentation, and great great takeaways from everybody. Great breakout room discussion, and but this is not the end.